Okay, so hey everyone. I met Bernadette last ServerlessConf about a month ago or something, and we chatted a bit about more and asked me if I would be interested to come in and just give a general overview of like a recap of the last ServerlessConf, but also like what I thought what could be interesting is to chat a little bit more about like the last couple of ServerlessConfs and how the discussions have changed specifically, like what people see as important and how like the people who are kind of engaged in that whole ecosystem, what they view as interesting to talk about and what everybody has kind of learned or figured out in some way. Just quickly to myself, so I'm an independent or serverless AWS consultant based here in Vienna. I was part of the founding team of CodeShip, which is a continuous integration, continuous delivery company, now based in Boston. And I was at Serverless Inc., CTO of Serverless Inc. for a while last year. And since like beginning of this year, just doing consulting basically around anything that is AWS, serverless, and all that kind of stuff. So there's also, I recently started like a few, like 2 or 3 months ago, the serverlessway.com, which is basically all about content around CloudFormation, AWS IAM, AWS in general, tooling that I put on there, and all that kind of stuff, like kind of the content that I write all the time. About different things, so definitely check that out if you're interested in some tooling that I or others write, and general content about serverless in and of itself. So yeah, with that, my plan was to just very briefly give you an overview of kind of my thoughts and how I perceive the community and what everybody's talking about, and then just go into questions, discussions, thoughts, and just see where we go from there. And I've also so the slide deck is also the one that I had in ServerlessConf, so if any specific, like I'll mention what the title was. If you guys want to go more into that, happy to go into more of that or anything else as well. So with that, how my perception of the last 3 ServerlessConfs, so about like the last year and a bit, that I've been more engaged in the serverless ecosystem and that I've seen changed is in London 2016, so that was like end October, November something 2016, a lot more. Not just in terms of the presentations, but also the discussions everyone had, was a lot more tooling and technology focused. So serverless framework, still at the time when I was at Serverless. Obviously, like all of those are super subjective because that's the stuff that I talked about, like I was interested the most in at the time, so talk to people more about. Doesn't necessarily mean that it's objectively everybody was interested in that area, but I felt like a lot of the people who have been in that for a long time have kind of been talking about that stuff. So again, more about tooling and technology. What is Lambda? How does Lambda work? What is functions as a service? Azure Web Services, Google Cloud Functions, if they ever get released properly. OpenWhisk was something that really came out. Azure Functions was a little bit more in like earlier stages or wasn't released, was being discussed about there. But everything was very focused on, okay, how do we actually make sense of the technology? What is the technology? And the tooling around it, how do we actually get started? So very basic discussions and very focused on more of the functions as a service side. So like, especially in the beginning, I had the feeling that serverless and functions as a service were an equivalent term, which definitely changed, in my opinion, now. But it was very much, okay, how does functions as a service and Lambda work and all that kind of stuff. I think with, that's not fans, fucking autocorrect. ServerlessConf Austin 2017, so that was in spring of this year. I think the discussion, especially from AWS and providers in general and vendors in general, moved more into the direction of, okay, what is serverless actually? And is serverless and functions as a service the same thing? Is Lambda everything there is to serverless in AWS? Or is there actually more to that? And I think especially AWS has really pushed very, very hard in saying, okay, Lambda is serverless compute, but RDS is serverless database, or RDS and all the database services that. And then there is batch for like background process, that is kind of serverless background processing. So a larger discussion that went away from just Lambda is the one thing that is serverless to more, it's more about the approach. It's more about that we don't really have to think about servers, that even like if you look at AWS batch, yes, there are EC2 instances, so servers in the background of that. But you as a developer and you as a team don't really think about the servers. Like they come up, they shut down. It doesn't really matter to you that much in the grand scheme of things. And I think that has been a large part of what happened in the intervening 6 months between London and Austin, where I think people started to get the technology side more, like Lambda, like the people who have been in this a while at that point and went to the conferences understood the technology, understood the limits and powers of the technology, and it was more about, okay, what other pieces are there to this whole puzzle, and how will this work out? And I think what changed for specifically in the last 6 months and up until this conference is I think that discussion moved a little bit higher even and went from, okay, here's tooling and technology, like let's figure out what function as a service and Lambda is. Okay, let's figure out what actually the whole scope of serverless is to, okay, now we kind of understand what the whole scope is, and we go to a place where we understand that it's more about the approach, about the team. So how do we build teams? How do we lead teams? How do we do automation? Something a little bit about tooling, but not necessarily in that way. But just generally, how does our approach to building infrastructure and thinking about infrastructure have to change? And I think that could also be seen in terms of like which kind of talks were in there. It's a lot more about how have large companies, large and small companies, really use serverless very well. Serverless infrastructure, AWS. In the end, I think a lot of the discussions there went from what is Lambda again to more how can we make use of all the different pieces, and how can we better understand that we're responsible for the glue in between to make sure that we can be super productive with using, but adopting serverless infrastructure, serverless tooling, serverless services, whatever you want to call it, on AWS. But I think the term, I think in discussions like that I had there a lot, and it would be interesting to get your thoughts on that and everybody else's who potentially was there. I think a lot of the discussions were really about, okay, like we understand what the tooling is there, we understand the challenges, but everything, like a lot of things are the same, but a lot of things are very, very different. When you approach your infrastructure, something that doesn't have long-running services or long-running servers, doesn't have long-running infrastructure in general. Everything is a service, and you just put some lambdas or some stuff in between where your business logic runs. Like especially when it comes to operations, to maintenance, to how productively can I as a developer get data out of AWS and information out of AWS to develop my features effectively. I think those discussions were really, really key and really, really important. And also like how can we train engineers, train our team in all the new services that are coming up. Basically, AWS is, as all of us know, incredibly large at this point and incredibly hard to really understand every service that is there and every service that constantly comes out. So I think how can we build a base in all of our teams that makes it possible for us that we can easily adopt anything that like they throw at us as quickly as possible or necessary, because we want to focus on the most important things, the business logic, the actual problem we're solving for customers. And I feel that has kind of changed. Like serverless and Lambda and functions as a service and all the other like terms that get thrown around for this, I think in terms of the discussion in that very specific community has really gone from a technical discussion to a approach, tooling, internal understanding, team problem, which I think is really interesting because that means that we now kind of as a community understand kind of we get the technical parts, and we get that it's not, the technical parts aren't necessarily that hard, but making it work for our teams that are sometimes not very accustomed to this way of doing things, to infrastructure that just isn't there. Everything is code, everything is automated. You don't just log into your servers or SSH into some machines, even through like some Bastion host or something. That's just not possible anymore, and you have to rethink how you do metrics and logging and everything there. So I think that has been over the last couple of months the biggest changes that I've seen, definitely in discussions. And yeah, I think specifically in New York, what I think the most important points were. So serverless is everywhere. Everything is kind of like the term serverless means anything for anyone. So I think it's gotten to a point where it's first of all it's rather meaningless, and everybody has their own definitions. Like for me, it's about the serverless team. Like for me, serverless is not a technical term. Sorry, I'm fiddling with the mic. For me, serverless is not a technical term, but a description of an approach in a team, which is very different to other people's definition. So I would take the term serverless very much with a grain of salt, because even with people who've discussed this for a long, long time, they have very different opinions, even after discussing the same wording a lot of times. But I think the common understanding is that it's about so much more than just compute. It's about so many more things and how you need to include them. And I think the limitation of compute, and especially how serverless gets communicated as something that replaces your EC2 instances, your Elastic Beanstalks, your compute layer, I think also points to a part of serverless that isn't the most important one. So for me, like obviously I don't know if you guys have read that blog post from like at this point quite a while ago, like the David Guetta campaign blog post where like they had millions of people at the same time going to the website, or like the Australian where some students built like a serverless government, like a serverless data collection service that the government failed completely in Australia, and they built something for a census very quickly. Like super nice stories, but how many services really need like millions of requests at one point, extremely spiky? That's 0.1% of applications, like maybe less. And I think over the past, the appeal, the content, the talk around serverless has often been in, hey, this is really cool for like your web application tier. But actually like Lambda and API gateway is for like a static load website that doesn't really have either even a lot of load, or even like something relatively static during the week, is a really hard technology to use, because API gateway is really complex in comparison to like just put your Rails app or your like whatever stack you're super comfortable with on like an Elastic Beanstalk, and it just runs, and like it doesn't really have to scale like crazy, and it just works well anyway. And I think that focus on the part of the web tier has kind of, in my opinion, diluted what actually is a big change. And I think that's more in infrastructure automation, or just generally in being able to put small pieces of code into all different kinds of events, and being able to do that, or because we were able to build scaling websites before. Like highly scaling websites were a thing before serverless came out. But just throwing random pieces of code in many different areas was something that you just didn't really do, because the overhead for every single one of these events was basically a pain to manage. Like you had to put it on some queue, you had to read it from somewhere. There was infrastructure involved, and now there isn't. Like just throwing a Lambda somewhere and combining it with an event is maybe a few like YAML file in CloudFormation or whatever, but there isn't that overhead involved anymore. And I think that's, in my opinion, and my feeling is that in the community, like that's getting more and more, there's more and more understanding that that's actually a thing that is going to change a lot of what we do and how we work. Because we can now do things like fixing our infrastructure automatically, putting some automated scaling into ECS very easily. I mean, they do have that now, but like very, very different things that just were kind of painful in the past, we just do all the time now. And there is no overhead, there is no pain involved anymore. And this means I think we can deal with much larger infrastructure on AWS with much smaller teams than we could before. Serverless isn't functions as a service. Functions as a service is obviously crucial. Again, functions as a service it's not a meaningless term, but it's also has a lot of different definitions at this point, I think. Again, the same points that I've actually been rambling on about for the last 15 or whatever minutes. So how we deal with different ways to develop in the team, how our approach, especially around operations and monitoring, like you can see it at the last ServerlessConf, a lot of different talks about operations and monitoring, because that's something that we seriously need to figure out. Like operations and monitoring in the past has been like, let me put that agent on that machine, or let me just SSH into the machine that is misbehaving. That kind of went away with containers. It definitely went away with serverless. So that's just not a thing anymore. And I think that's, for a lot of teams and a lot of people, that's a big shift. How do we build our teams? Because I think one of the things that is also, in my opinion, different now is the power that one single developer has. Like if you as a single developer really know how to automate on AWS and use the high-level AWS services effectively, you can get so much more done. If you as a developer don't know like IAM very well, you'll always have trouble, because you'll either build insecure systems or you have to ask a colleague every single time. And so I think that's kind of a big issue, that as developers, even as like infrastructure people or web application people, you have to know so much more about AWS to be really effective, because your stuff isn't just, you're not building just one web application and then whatever, like here operations team run it somewhere. That's not how things work anymore, because you work with so many different AWS services in so many different ways, and it is so deeply integrated into each other that you have to be at least somewhat of an expert in AWS. And I think that's something that a lot of teams find out right now, especially large organizations. And they go like, how do we deal with this? Like, how do we teach this to everyone? How do we teach this approach and this knowledge to everyone? And that's where like a lot of them have huge trouble to just making sure that that approach is properly there for everyone to understand. And the tooling is there. I mean, we all on a regular basis suffer with the AWS tooling. They build great services and they build lousy tools, and they will never build good, in my opinion, never build good tools, because that's not who they are. And I mean, which is great, because then people like me who like building tools can build cool tools. But yeah, it's just not what they do. And I think that as well, like how can we teach teams to properly automate and use AWS in that automated way effectively. I said that before. So yeah, so thank you. That was my kind of rambling thoughts on the last serverless conferences. And yeah, I'm now happy to go into any questions, thoughts, if Bernhard maybe give his perspective on that as well. Yeah.
So all the talk about web operations, web stuff, web whatever, been there, done that. I've now got other gigs. I have this feeling that, one, that's an observation, okay, so I have this feeling that, like what you said, hey, we're doing operations now. It's kind of like there's a ton of business logic and bash scripts out there.
Yes.
And now it gets replaced by serverless or whatever. Serverless. Yep. That is, I totally agree, that is going to like bite everyone and then some sooner or later, definitely. Because it's not just technology that I agree with totally. It's really about the people, like you said, like hey, I can get around it by AWS colon stuff. Yay! And let's go.
Hey, you're fired.
Yeah, maybe. And the other thing is, like, did anyone really talk about workflows that are not web workflows? Where I am right now is like, hey, one event has like on average 150 to 200 gigs. That's a single event. So forget Kafka.
Yeah. Gigs, you mean like the data that gets sent?
That you need that much data. That's a single file you get. That's one event, and you probably need like input to analyze on that, like 50 of them.
Yep.
So that's like genomic data research and stuff. Sure. Did anyone talk about this kind of workflows?
Yeah. So I think, so not specifically about like the large sets, but I think one thing that has changed is where in the beginning was like functions as a service, small events that do small things and run for a very short time. Whereas now, and that is like I'm definitely projecting my own subjective opinion on that because I think that's the direction where it goes and I'm pushing for that. But I think things like AWS batch, basically you put something into a queue and then it starts an EC2 instance, whichever EC2 instance you need, works on that job and then kills that machine. For me, perfectly serverless, because you as a developer, you don't really care if it's like batch running an EC2 instance or a Lambda function. It's because from a management perspective, it might be slightly different, but not very different, because it just goes away when you don't need it anymore. And I think that's something that, like, for example, in that case, I would probably use something like batch. I think that makes probably the most sense, but it depends on like the specifics. But I think that kind of discussion is definitely happening, where the term serverless is definitely expanding as long as the approach stays the same. So obviously, like, you don't want to SSH into the machines, you have logging and metrics properly enabled everywhere. Everything gets started, stopped automatically. No, I think not paying, I think what a lot of people come down to with kind of like what they mean with serverless is, or at least what AWS is pushing very hard is, I'm not paying for idle compute resources. So if the server shuts down, once you don't need it anymore, automatically, like without you doing anything, at least according to AWS, that's completely considered serverless. And I generally agree with that definition, although I think it's not broad enough to what I would say. But those kinds of workloads, definitely. I think there's a lot of different, like, generally enterprise teams coming in and talking about how they use serverless and AWS in general for various different workloads. From like, I think it was Expedia talking about how they use Poly and different other data sets to dynamically create like text-to-speech stuff outside. So I don't, like for your specific workload, I don't have an example of like the last ServerlessConf, but I certainly talk to people who have similar problems. Video encoding, for example, is a similar one. You just can't do it in Lambda. It just doesn't work.
Time off is something big.
Exactly.
Too small.
Exactly. And not enough flexibility, and also like costs. It's simply like for things where you have to optimize on cost, or you have to have like specific hardware. Some of the people who want to use like a GPU for something, you just can't do that in Lambda. And I hope that's why I think like where it's interesting when you have Lambda, but you have other services that give you more control, but a very similar approach. I think that's where definitely AWS is pushing it, where I see a lot of the community moving to. But it won't be the same service. Like I hope they never make Lambda more complex than it is and just create other services that give you that flexibility. So you can say maybe, hey, I'll start with Lambda, but then I'll expand to ECS, or I go be here or there or there. I think that's one of the approaches as well in AWS. It's not, we're not building for the long term anymore. Like any specific thing that we build in AWS, maybe there comes out a new service or a new feature that makes the way we build it here obsolete or too expensive, too error prone, so we might want to change into something else. But to be able to do that, to very quickly, obviously we want to evaluate, make sure that it works properly, but to be able to do that, all the people in our team need to understand automation, need to understand metrics and logging, so we actually do it the right way, and we can reproduce it in staging and all that kind of stuff. I think that kind of discussion, like how can we move from one service to the next, to the next, to the next, has definitely been part of at least my conversations, but I gave a talk exactly about that, so I'm not super convinced that people talk to me about that kind of stuff, because that's what I'm really interested in. Like, how can teams start with the simplest service that AWS gives you, and then just expand where necessary? Because most parts of our infrastructure, like, they stay simple. Like, there's only a small part of infrastructure, I think, that really grows very complex in terms of scale, cost, or whatever. But most parts are simple, so they can stay in like Lambda or like Elastic Beanstalk or whatever.
Totally the spot, I think. I think it resembles even in like the documentation that you get from AWS at this point. Because like CloudFormation, that's like great. Until then you thought, oh, everything is YAML, everything is JSON, that's so cool. And then you get to the first tutorial that says, custom resources, this is how you do serverless. And you have your typical person like learning this service really, really well, and suddenly 3 other services come in. Like, oh, Lambda, now custom resources. IAM, ooh, that's just like the side topic there. But yeah, right.
And that's
we have to like catch up to the real world and the real problem.
Yep. Just as a very slight pitch, that's exactly what I wanted to do on the serverless way, because I'm kind of getting sick of when I do like a consulting gig to go through the same things again. So it's very much a here's the most important parts of CloudFormation, the most important parts of IAM, of like the AWS CLI. The AWS CLI is, in my opinion, one of the most underused resources or things that in AWS. Like, so many people go on a daily, like on a second by second basis to the AWS console and click around, and it's very unproductive in my opinion, to not use any other kind of word. I think I personally, I'm trying to get more and more, I'm building tools around that and trying to get more and more towards a place where I absolutely never want to use that. And for the next company that we're currently starting, my plan is to just completely disable the AWS console for everyone. Like, there is no clicky UI for you, basically. And because it's super unproductive. Like, it's extremely unproductive, and it forces people to not automate things. Like, once you remove the UI interface, you either go CloudFormation or AWS CLI. But there is automation involved. And it's like AWS CLI is a great bash SDK. It's a really shitty tool or a CLI. It's a really good bash SDK. So like, build your own tools. Like, use it to like put in a makefile and do your own stuff. And I think that's kind of, that part got neglected in terms of like what AWS is doing and how a lot of teams, in my opinion, teach AWS to their people. Because it's painful to get started with, but it needs to happen. Very more random. Any other questions?
Yes, I think you're the expert. What do you think about a serverless application model and compared to serverless framework? I mean, I'm sure this question comes up a lot, but
sure.
you somehow need to pick your deployment tool, and from my perspective, it's not so easy. Which
I think so. So just as I'm not using the serverless framework myself really for a lot of stuff, because so basically what serverless framework is doing is it translates some simpler config into CloudFormation. Especially API gateway CloudFormation is extremely painful. Like that is just crazy painful. So I think it's doing a good job there. SAM does kind of the same. I think SAM, so when AWS announced, I don't know what the code name for that was before, like they launched SAM, they announced something that it will be like massive and huge and great, and then they internally found out, oh shit, we can't do this. So they like scaled it down and scaled it down. And now it's it's a little bit of a nicer, in my opinion, stolen from serverless implementation of like a DSL, but a very simple one. And so I think personally, like SAM makes sense, like use it because it's in CloudFormation if you want to. But it's not like the value you get from SAM is very, very little compared to just using straight up CloudFormation. Like it's a little bit there, but it's not a lot. I think the serverless framework with any tool or framework on AWS, it includes its own abstractions and its own ideas, especially because it tries to be multi-provider somehow. The main problem with that is that as soon as you need to do something that the framework kind of isn't good at, you have problems because you kind of have to somehow reach through the tool or do it in a way or like write your own plugin and all that kind of stuff, which you can totally do, but then that's a problem. So I think things like in my opinion, tooling on AWS, you'll never use one tool on AWS. Like I think those times were in the past where you had like, I think I had that. In the past, we had, basically we took standard servers and then we somehow made an infrastructure out of that by having some smart tool, combine them into application clusters, database clusters, data and ETL pipelines. That time is completely gone. Or if you really use AWS to its fullest extent, that is gone because you don't control all that kind of stuff. You have this kind of stuff where like you use this service here, this service there, this AWS infrastructure piece from here a server, here's some Lambda, here API gateway. That's a very kind of different approach. But no tool, no single tool, in my opinion, can map this. Here, you needed a very, very intelligent tool to make all this possible. Here, in my opinion, you need some low-level, very easy-to-use tools to make the standardized interfaces from AWS give them a good developer experience. So I think that's for me like one of the sentences that I try to keep in mind is that in the past we took custom infrastructure and standardized them through a tool. Now we have standard infrastructure pieces and we can customize them. We can customize our tools because they all talk against the standard interface and standard pieces. So that's where I think like customizing your tool, making them work exactly for what you need, and using things like the AWS CLI to like have your own bash scripts or make files or tools is really powerful. But yeah, so I think, so that was a long way to say, I think the serverless framework or SAM can be really great for some use cases, especially if you just want to use, like if you want to use them for API gateway and Lambda. As soon as you use SAM or SAM or the serverless framework for anything that goes a little bit outside of like API gateway and like the most basic Lambda use cases, I wouldn't use it. I would use straight CloudFormation because it'll be painful. Cool. Thanks, everyone. By the way, one quick thing before, because there was a question about like the tooling and automation. I do use CloudFront and S3 buckets as well for that, and I have a CloudFormation script that I'm happy to send to you guys, or I can share the link as well where I have the open source. It'll deploy everything, including redirect buckets and templates, and not templates, certificates as well. So if you want to have that, let me know. Happy to send you the link.
Maybe one question. Did you see any more intense talks about functions as service on top of Docker orchestrators like Kubernetes and that stuff?
So,
or is it more on the vendor side?
So that stuff is coming. So in my opinion, all the like anything with like OpenWhisk or all the like functions as a service stuff in container infrastructure is in my opinion, misses the point. The main point of like functions as a service or like Lambda as a service for me is that I can get random events from like everywhere in AWS, from like infrastructure that comes from everywhere, and I can react to events from it. So I can use Lambda to act on like CloudWatch events, CloudWatch logs, to like S3 bucket, like something input in S3 bucket, DynamoDB or whatever. Like it's a standard way to just plug little pieces into many different kind of slots throughout the infrastructure. And I think things like OpenWhisk or like a lot of the like Docker, like they try to get the execution model, so they reduce it down to, hey, I can, like, you can give me very simple code and I'll execute it for you, but I could already do that with containers. So I think that's, for me, is like the actual benefit of the whole like event-driven kind of idea gets kind of lost, and I haven't really seen a lot. Like I think there's a lot of like, there's more and more kind of open source frameworks or like OpenFast and all that kind of stuff that has been coming out and is getting more and more interest. And OpenWhisk kind of does, but I think it's all like, that is kind of on the fringes, like there is a little bit about that, but I see not a lot of like traction, especially in anything that has like some meaningful infrastructure. I haven't really seen any kind of traction on that. And any kind of really like a lot of interest in the communications, like as much as AVN tries to create like interest in it, I don't, at least in this kind of very like in the small like community of people who go to the serverless conferences regularly and are on the Slack channel, I don't really see a lot of like actual interest, because it doesn't actually solve the problem. Like the problem is, I want to have small pieces of code that react to many different things, and OpenWhisk or OpenFast or whatever, they don't solve that.
Was there any good talk in terms of, because the problem that I see is if you have a larger setup with really many components, how do you orchestrate all of that? So especially if you introduce change into such a system, everything is connected. Was there any good progress or any new ideas on getting some structure into a complex mesh of serverless components?
Nothing specifically in terms of like tooling or anything. Yeah. I think the most important one was automation. Like really making sure that everything is fully automated, works really well together, is fully tested. So I think that's also like there isn't, and I think that's the kind of different approach that AWS has in terms of compared to Google with like Kubernetes, where like everything is Kubernetes, and so Kubernetes is the one smart tool that does everything for you, which I think is an interesting approach. Just one that, even though AWS is probably launching Kubernetes as a service at reInvent, is not like, that's not how AWS rolls. Like AWS, I think there was a question before about like why they have so many different regions and so many different services in each region, because they don't work in a unified manner. Like they just push really hard. Like they tell every team to push as hard as they can and just leave everything else behind. Like one of the things, best example is CloudFormation doesn't support so many different features or services in AWS. It's driving me crazy. But that's how they can make it really fast, because launching a service doesn't mean you have to have CloudFormation support. So that's kind of their approach, is they just go really, like they're very distributed in terms of their teams. They go really fast on each team, really fast in each region. And when something's ready, it's ready and it's launched. And when it's not ready, it's not launched. Which I think is cool, but very different from Google, who want everything to be perfect, but then everything is beta and never launched. So I think it's very unfair. Like that's super unfair, but it's just the way it is.
Any updates on the API gateway? They make it more user-friendly, so end-user-friendly?
They recently launched, so API gateway doesn't necessarily have its own CloudFront distribution anymore. So you can plug your own CloudFront distribution API gateway now, which is awesome, because that was super useful. Cool. Thanks everyone.